Welcome back to our channel. Hope you all are fine. Tell us in the comments from where you are watching our video. Let's begin with another day of aviation miracle. It began like every other routine flight. Flight 227, a mid-morning departure from Los Angeles bound for Denver. The sun was bright, the air shimmering with the lazy calm of a late spring morning. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into their seats, the familiar hum of engines filling the fuselage like a steady heartbeat. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-800, was a machine born from decades of aviation precision, built to endure storms, cross distances, and ferry lives safely across the sky. The pilots performed their pre-flight checklist with quiet confidence. Everything was nominal. Hydraulics, avionics, electrical systems, fuel flow all within limits. At Gate 53, the captain's voice echoed faintly through the PA. "Welcome aboard Flight 227. For most on board, it was background noise, a prelude to another uneventful journey. But among the passengers was one man whose presence, though unnoticed, would become the thread holding hundreds of lives together. Seat 14A, a middle-aged man traveling home after visiting his family. Unknown to others, he was an off-duty commercial pilot, flying as a passenger for the first time in months. The aircraft taxied out onto the runway, the golden California light glinting off its wings. Engines spooled up with a deep roar, and soon Flight 227 sliced through the air, rising gracefully above the sprawl of the city. The world below turned miniature. Highways became lines, buildings like toy blocks. Cruise altitude 35,000 feet. Outside, the sky stretched endless and blue. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of a peaceful journey. Flight attendants rolled carts, serving coffee and smiles. Passengers reclined, some lost in screens, others in thoughts. Everything utterly ordinary. But high above Nevada, small signs began to whisper through the cockpit systems. A flicker on an electrical bus, a momentary blip on the autopilot channel. It was nothing serious, not yet. Aircraft systems are built with layers of redundancy, and minor alerts come and go like static in the background of flight. The captain noted it mentally, cross-checked instruments, and continued. Outside the cockpit door, the cabin felt unchanged. Calm, still suspended in blue air. Hours into the flight, the first true anomaly struck. A sudden, brief shudder ran through the aircraft, subtle enough that only a few passengers noticed. Inside the cockpit, warning tones flickered across the display. Autopilot disengaged. Electrical bus 2 lost sync. The captain re-engaged systems manually, isolating the problem. But within minutes, a cascade began, small failures rippling through the network. Navigation screens flickered. One by one, non-critical systems shut down. For passengers, the hum of the cabin grew uneven. Lights dimmed for a few seconds, then steadied. Some looked up, curious, then went back to their magazines. Nothing seemed urgent. But in the cockpit, things were changing fast. When redundancy layers begin to fail in a modern airliner, pilots rely on training and procedure. A precise choreography of switches, resets, and crossfeeds. They were in control until they weren't. At 35,000 feet, the entire right-side avionics network went dark. Communication with air traffic control crackled, then dropped. Now the captain faced a rare and dangerous scenario: partial electrical failure with control, feedback log. The co-pilot reached for the QRH, the quick reference handbook, flipping to the emergency power section. But the problem was spreading faster than they could isolate it. Inside the cabin, turbulence began to shake the plane gently. Seatbelt signs chimed, flight attendants moved quickly to secure carts. Still, most passengers remained unaware that Flight 227 was slowly sliding into one of the rarest emergencies a modern jet could face. Then came the sharp dip, a brief drop, then a slow right bank. Passengers gasped. Loose items slid across tray tables. A child cried out. Up front, the control yoke trembled under the captain's hands. The right side control input was delayed, a sign the flight computers weren't syncing correctly. In modern aircraft, multiple flight control computers interpret pilot inputs. When one lags, the other tries to compensate. But when both fall out of sync, control becomes unpredictable. The captain tried to stabilize the aircraft manually, but each correction came a second too late. Reverting to alternate control law, he muttered, the last automated layer between control and chaos. But then, silence. The primary displays went black. Back in row 14A, the off-duty pilot looked up from his book. He'd felt the slight roll before anyone else noticed. His instincts, trained over thousands of hours in the sky, told him something was wrong. He glanced around, eyes scanning the cabin's subtle signs, flight attendants pausing mid-step, the air pressure shift, the faint change in engine sound. Something wasn't right. Then the public address crackled once and died. No announcements. No sound from the cockpit. The engine still roared, but the plane felt strangely hollow, disconnected, like it was gliding inside a silent storm. At 35,000 feet, Flight 227 was now flying blind, partial systems dead, communication lost, and uncertain control authority. Up front, the pilots worked methodically to restart bus power, but the main flight management computer refused to reinitialize. They still had engine thrust and manual control, but limited instruments. That's when the captain glanced back. In the log, the system showed one curious note: secondary control locked out. He knew what that meant. The control authority might be stuck to one side. One pilot could lose partial input control. He turned to his first officer. They looked at each other, a silent agreement. They'd need help if it got worse. And unknowingly, just a few rows behind them sat the only person on board capable of saving. Flight 227. The sun dipped behind the horizon as they crossed into Colorado airspace. Darkness crept along the edges of the sky, and the cabin lights flickered once more. What began as a routine flight was now suspended in uncertainty. A crippled aircraft, two pilots fighting to maintain stability, and a silent passenger, who didn't yet know he was about to become the key to everyone's survival. Darkness had begun to settle outside. The horizon bled orange into violet, the last light of day fading behind the aircraft's tail. Inside the cabin of Flight 227, the air felt heavy, not because of turbulence, but because of something far quieter: uncertainty. The hum of the engine still filled the space, but it wasn't the same even rhythm anymore. It pulsed unevenly, a soft vibration, then a hollow pause like a heart skipping a beat. In the cockpit, the two pilots stared at screens that had gone mostly black. Only a few instruments glowed faintly in standby amber. Their flight path display had vanished. Communication radios flickered in static, and navigation modes were frozen. The airplane was flying, but blind. The primary systems had failed, and now even the backup electrical bus wasn't responding. The aircraft's heartbeat, its constant data, lights, and tones, was fading. Still, the engines continued to push them through the thinning air. Thrust stable, altitude steady for now. The captain switched the system to emergency power. The cockpit darkened even more. Only faint backup gauges and analog dials visible in the dim glow. In that cold blue darkness, they could hear every sound: the vibration of air over metal, the rattle of the flight deck door, the distant murmurs of passengers unaware of what was happening. They were trained for this, but only in simulators under control. This was chaos creeping quietly. The first officer tried the auxiliary. Radio. Nothing. The last transmission, with ATC, had ended mid-sentence. No one on the ground knew they were now flying half-blind, disconnected from the network that guided every modern flight. Back in the cabin, the seatbelt sign had come on again. A low rumble of conversation moved like a wave through the rows. People sensed something. Maybe turbulence, maybe more. The flight attendants exchanged glances, masking concern with practiced calm. They moved slowly down the aisle, checking belts, whispering reassurance. But the off-duty pilot in 14A wasn't reassured. He'd noticed more than the others: the change in sound frequency, the flicker pattern of cabin lights, and a slight, almost imperceptible, drift in roll angle. The aircraft wasn't holding straight anymore. He leaned slightly toward the window. Outside, the horizon line wasn't level. His instincts confirmed what his training screamed. The plane had lost part of its control feedback. He sat back slowly, breathing evenly. Years in the cockpit had taught him something most passengers never understood. When silence replaces chatter on a flight deck, something serious is happening. In the cockpit, the captain checked manual control inputs. The right aileron wasn't responding properly. Hydraulic pressure showed unstable readings. That meant one thing: partial control degradation. They could keep the aircraft level, but turning, climbing, or descending could cause unpredictable responses. At that altitude, one wrong control input could overstress the frame, so they held steady, hoping to isolate the fault. Minutes turned into long, heavy seconds. Altitude stable at 35,000 feet. Speed drifting slightly. Navigation unreliable. And then, like a slow heartbeat fading, the standby attitude indicator, the one small horizon display still active, began to tilt on its own. That wasn't possible unless the internal gyros were losing reference. The captain realized they were losing attitude awareness. They might not even know if they were level or banking until it was too late. Back in the cabin, a faint metallic smell began to drift. Ozone. The scent of overworked circuits or electrical discharge. Some passengers looked around, confused. The off-duty pilot tightened his seatbelt, eyes fixed on the sound of the engines. They were steady, but his instincts told him the plane was slipping ever so slightly to the right. He felt it before anyone else, the shift in gravity, the subtle pressure on his shoulder as the aircraft leaned. It was happening again. He glanced at the overhead signs. The fastened seatbelts light flickered twice, then steadied. The intercom clicked once. Silence followed. No captain's voice, no instructions. Something had gone very wrong up front. In the flight deck, the captain tried to regain navigation data using backup alignment, but both flight control computers had frozen in sync error. He could still see the engine parameters, but not their orientation relative to the ground. It was like steering a car with the headlights off on a winding road in the dark. He reached for manual override, a switch hidden low near the center console, but even that showed unstable readings. That's when he realized the deeper problem. The electrical failure had spread into flight control interface modules. The plane was still flying, but only because of momentum and luck. The first officer looked over the backup charts. They could attempt a slow descent. But without navigation data, any descent could lead to terrain conflict. They were somewhere near the Rockies. They couldn't risk it blind. So they kept the altitude. Every pilot fears one thing above all else: uncertainty. Flight 227 was now flying through it. Inside the cabin, unease began to grow. Whispers, confused looks, restless shifting in seats. The cabin lights flickered again, dimmed for several seconds, then returned with a reddish emergency hue. People knew something was wrong now. He waited, patient, calm, focused, as the air around him thickened with tension. Then it came. The faint, distant sound of the engine's shifting pitch. Not a failure, but a manual thrust change. The pilots were flying by feel now. He closed his eyes for a moment. He could picture what was happening in the cockpit. He knew the rhythm, the sound, the silence between alarm tones. Something inside him clicked, instinct overriding hesitation. He unbuckled slowly, steadying himself against the seat back as the aircraft trembled slightly in turbulence. The nearest flight attendant looked at him, eyes wide. He didn't speak, but the look on his face said everything. He wasn't just another passenger. He was about to help save the flight. As he moved forward, steadying himself through the narrow aisle, the storm outside the windows began to flash with faint lightning. The aircraft trembled, slicing through the upper atmosphere, half blind and half controlled. And at 35,000 feet, a silent, steady man was walking toward the cockpit door, toward the heart of the crisis, toward the place where his presence would soon make the difference between catastrophe and survival. The cabin lights flickered once more, long enough for passengers to glimpse each other's faces, pale and uncertain in the dim red glow. Outside the windows, lightning pulsed far off in the clouds, faint but steady, illuminating the shape of the wings as the aircraft pressed on into the darkness. At 35,000 feet, Flight 227 was silent. The calm hum that once filled the cabin now carried a strange, hollow tone, an emptiness that no one could name. The off-duty pilot moved forward carefully, gripping each seat as turbulence trembled through the fuselage. The aircraft's slow drift was becoming visible even to untrained eyes, a slight right roll corrected, then slipping again. The flight attendants exchanged quick glances as he passed. They didn't stop him. Something in his expression told them he knew what he was doing. Ahead, the cockpit door stood closed, a thin barrier between panic and control. The emergency lighting cast it in a dull orange glow. The hum of electronics, faint, unstable, leaked through from the other side. Then the door opened. Inside, the cockpit was a world apart, dark, silent, alive with warning lights and flickering shadows. The captain sat forward, hands tense on the controls. His co-pilot moved methodically through the emergency checklist, but most of the instruments were blank. The main display screens were gone. Only the small standby attitude indicator and analog gauges glowed dimly. The man from 14A stepped in quietly, scanning the panels with a pilot's instinctive precision. One glance told him everything. The airplane had lost partial electrical control, both flight control computers frozen, and the right side system unresponsive. Manual control barely. He steadied himself behind the center console, reading the situation without a word. Outside the windshield, lightning flickered again, bright enough to show the endless cloud mass below, stretching toward the mountains of Colorado. They had no navigation display, no flight director, and fuel was beginning to run low. The captain reached for the manual reversion switch, the final layer between automation and mechanical control. The response was sluggish, but the yoke felt heavier now. The aircraft answering in slow, delayed movements. Manual flight fully engaged. It was a strange mix of relief and dread. The airplane was alive again, but every adjustment now carried risk. The off-duty pilot leaned closer, eyes tracing the patterns of backup lights, scanning the gyros, confirming pitch and roll by instinct. He recognized the tremor in the control column, a vibration he'd felt once before. During a simulator test years ago, it meant unstable feedback. The aircraft could oscillate if overcorrected. He adjusted the trim slightly, steadying the pitch in small, measured steps. The nose leveled. For a moment, the cockpit was still. Outside, the clouds parted briefly, the last traces of sunset vanishing behind them as night took over the sky. Below, a vast darkness stretched across the landscape, broken only by faint city lights far to the east. They had to descend soon. Electrical power was fading. In the cabin, passengers clung to armrests as the turbulence intensified. A few whispered prayers. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain and ozone, the signature of a high-altitude storm. The aircraft dipped slightly, then leveled. It wasn't graceful, but it was control. The first real control they'd had in nearly an hour. At the front, a flight attendant stood near the bulkhead, eyes locked on the cockpit door. Inside, 3 pilots, 2 at the controls. One standing behind, worked without speaking, their world reduced to the rhythm of gauges and instincts. The wind buffeted the fuselage, shaking the entire airframe in rhythmic pulses. The altimeter ticked down slowly. Manual descent had begun. Without modern navigation systems, flying becomes a matter of senses, pressure, sound, vibration. They were doing it the old way, the way pilots once did before automation ruled the sky. Every 1,000 feet, the off-duty pilot cross-checked instruments. Attitude, airspeed, pitch, thrust. Everything had to stay balanced. Too steep and they'd overspeed. Too shallow and they'd stall. The oxygen masks hadn't deployed, a silent reminder they were still at a dangerous altitude. The air outside was thin, the temperature near -50 degrees Celsius. Inside the cockpit, condensation began to gather on the glass from their breath. The faint hiss of static filled the radio, background noise from a system. Still half alive, they tried transmitting again. Flight 227 requesting emergency vectors, but the radio emitted only broken bursts of static. No reply. They were still alone. Below them, lightning began to pulse more frequently. A sprawling storm system forming across the Colorado plains. Descending through it was the only way to get to breathable air and clearer control. But it was also dangerous. They had no weather radar, no visual reference. The off-duty pilot took one long breath, steadying himself. He placed his hand lightly on the yoke to feel the movement. It trembled slightly, alive, unpredictable. Every vibration told a story. Every sound had meaning. He nodded once, silent understanding shared among professionals. Then the engines throttled back slightly, the aircraft nose dipping again. The descent deepened. Outside, lightning illuminated. The wings, water vapor streaming along the surface in ghostly trails. The plane entered cloud. Darkness swallowed them. In the cabin, passengers felt the change instantly. A deep, low rumble echoed through the fuselage as the aircraft cut into the dense cloud layer. The windows glowed white for seconds at a time, each flash freezing the world in blinding light. The seatbelt sign glowed steady red. Turbulence hit hard. Loose items rattled. Overhead bins creaked. Someone gasped. But even through the chaos, the plane continued its measured descent. Alive, controlled, surviving. The off-duty pilot's steady hand kept the pitch smooth, countering each lurch of air with a calm adjustment. The instruments quivered but held. Altitude 25,000 feet. Still no communication. And then a flicker. On the secondary panel, a faint green light blinked to life. A single data link. Partial electrical recovery. They had power returning through the auxiliary bus. Not much, but enough. The captain reached for the transponder, fingers moving with renewed urgency. If they could just re-establish contact, they could get vectors. A path out of the storm, a heading to safety. The static hissed, then cleared for one brief second. A voice, broken, distant, barely audible. Flight 227. Radar contact lost. Do you read? It wasn't clear, but it was something. They weren't alone anymore. Altitude 21,000 feet. Outside, the storm thinned slightly. Below the clouds, a patch of dark land and scattered. Lights appeared, the edge of Colorado's flat plains. Inside the cockpit, tension shifted to focus. They had one chance to align for an emergency descent and find an airport. Maybe Denver, maybe somewhere closer. The off-duty pilot steadied the controls again, eyes fixed on the dim glow of the instruments. Every heartbeat of the aircraft echoed through the yoke. Flight 227 was alive. Broken, bleeding power, but alive. And 3 men in the dark sky were bringing her home. Outside, the night sky had begun to fade into a bruised purple horizon. The storm was still alive, lightning distant, but echoing like a memory. Inside Flight 227, the cabin felt weightless, caught between fear and faith. The engines roared unevenly, their rhythm broken. Yet the aircraft still held itself together. Every second in the air was a victory against impossible odds. In the cockpit, the off-duty passenger worked alongside the remaining pilot. His hands steady despite the chaos. Both men moved in near silence, their focus absolute. The left hydraulic system was gone. The autopilot was dead. Flight controls were stiff, sluggish, almost unresponsive. But there was still one thing working, the will to survive. Manual descent had begun. The altimeter needle trembled, dropping slowly. Through the cockpit glass, streaks of light appeared as the aircraft pierced through the final layer of storm cloud. Beyond that barrier lay open sky, pale, washed by dawn. It was the first light they had seen in over 40 minutes of darkness. Back in the cabin, passengers watched through. Small oval windows as golden light spilled into the aisles. The air still hummed with pressure, but something had changed. Fear no longer screamed, it whispered. A mother loosened her grip on her child's hand. A businessman shut his eyes, quietly mouthing a prayer. The aircraft was still descending, but it was steady. At 10,000 feet, the turbulence eased. The passenger who had stepped into the cockpit now faced a choice. Try to reach the nearest runway or ditch into open fields. Fuel readings were uncertain. Communications were only partially restored. The weather radar still glowed red near the coast, but inland skies were clearer. The decision had to be made, and fast. Through cracked static, the faint voice of air traffic control broke in. Their coordinates were confirmed. A small regional airport was 30 miles ahead. No commercial strip, no long asphalt runways, just a stretch of emergency tarmac used for training. It wasn't built for a Boeing 737, but it was the only chance left. The co-pilot adjusted trim manually while the passenger took control of descent rate. The aircraft was heavy, nose slightly pitching down. The flaps had to be extended slowly, or the remaining hydraulic pressure could burst. Every motion counted. Every decision was life or death. The ground came into view, faint lines of roads, rivers, scattered lights from villages just waking up. The plane roared low across farmland. Below, farmers looked up, hearing what sounded like thunder but wasn't. It was Flight 227, gliding without grace but with purpose. Inside, the cabin lights flickered one last time before power went out completely. Silence. Then, the sound of wheels meeting Earth. A violent impact shook the fuselage. Sparks flew from the landing gear. The nose dipped, skidding hard across the short runway. Oxygen masks swung wildly as luggage burst free. The entire frame screamed in metallic protest. And then, stillness. Dust rose into the dawn air. For a moment, no one moved. The aircraft had stopped halfway down the strip, broken but intact. Emergency exits opened, passengers stepping out onto the grass, faces pale in disbelief. The morning sun broke through the clouds, catching the metal of the wounded jet in gold light. The passenger, the one who had left his seat and walked into chaos, stood back near the wing, staring at what was once 70 tons of airborne fear. There was no applause, no announcement, just the quiet breath of survival. Later reports would confirm what had happened. A dual power failure triggered by lightning-induced short circuits, a chain of system collapses that should have doomed the flight. But one man, a commercial pilot traveling off duty, flying home unnoticed, had seen the signs early enough, understood the instruments, and guided the crippled aircraft by instinct and experience alone. Flight 227 would go down in history as one of the few commercial jets to survive complete electrical failure mid-air. For those on board, it wasn't just a technical miracle, it was a reminder of what calm courage looks like when the sky turns against you. And long after the storm had passed, in hangars and investigations, one truth remained unspoken but deeply felt. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. They just sit among us, waiting for the moment when courage quietly takes control.